Hey everybody, welcome to Cryptids, Pranks, and Iconoclast. I'm your host, Mike no Haikaboshi. I believe the correct translation for that is Mike the Beetlejuice. I know that Haikaboshi is Japanese, the Japanese name for Beetlejuice, the star, not the Michael Keaton vehicle, although they're both great in their own ways. Yeah, today's episode is going to be a strange one. We're going to Japan and China and India as well, I believe. The reason for that, I say, is because some of the myths and folklore and religious texts and cultural imports, basically, like, for example, Buddhism came from India to China and then made its way through Korea into Japan. And so you see a lot of movement and interplay geographically between a lot of folklore and religion and mythology, things of this nature. So it does kind of spread all over. So trust me when I say I'm not trying to be culturally insensitive. If I end up doing that, I apologize. It is not my intention. I mostly just want to tell a few stories about some of the myths and legends and a particular historical figure and some historical facts of what happened, some historical events that took place predominantly in Japan back in the day during the Heian period, which I believe is from about 794 to 1185. So roughly about 1,000 years ago. I'm going to forego our audio segment for today. Since I released those two little mini-sodes earlier this week, I'm trying to learn to use my DAW, my digital audio workstation. Almost sounds like DAW. Almost. But yeah, to learn more of the tricks of the trade, get better at using it. I was remixing YouTube video audio of crackheads and people having meltdowns, etc. for fun. Also because I got to get my stupid out. I get the stupid out having fun doing that, and then I have fun doing this as well. So this is the more intellectually cogent side, at least if I if I did it right. Plus, by getting the stupid out, should the occasion arise that I end up saying some really ill shit that may or may not galvanize a revolution in this country, I always have the plausible deniability of going back and saying, just listen to this. I'm just a silly man. I'm just being a silly man. Being silly and making these silly things. So no one will take me seriously when I do say some serious shit. So that could come in handy down the line, I think. Probably better than the alternative. Another little bit of a reoccurring theme through today's show is going to be sort of building your own inner mythology. What I mean by that is this is sort of like I would call it almost an approach to practicing occultism, but it's sort of a way to personalize pre-existing mythologies that exist in the world, like seeing yourself in them or building a kinship with them, for lack of a better term, I guess would be a good way to put it. And having grown up on 80s and 90s anime, I was very influenced by the aesthetics of it. I'm not so much a fan of a lot of the storytelling techniques or characterization methods that they use, especially in modern anime. But that 80s, 90s era, that's a sweet spot. And that's where there was like a certain like dark aesthetic to it that just makes for, oh man, I just love it, you know? And like Dark City and, I don't know, Doomed Megalopolis, which will play somewhat repeatedly into this episode, that particular anime from back in the day, and its main character, Yasunori Kato, and the topic of today's show, a Japanese sorcerer, for lack of a better term, their equivalent to Merlin, if you will, and his name is Abe No Seimei, and we'll get into his story a little bit, and from there use that as kind of a jumping off point, a springboard into some of the more stranger mythological points, as well as some of my own theories that I've taken out of certain Eastern occult practices. So, yeah, it'll be a weird one. And for what's weird this week, I have a extra special segment that I want to do. It's called the psychic test. Now, if you're able to listen in and join along, this is a visualization exercise. So if you're able to kind of find a quiet place, somewhere you can close your eyes and sort of concentrate on what I'm saying, and we will go on a bit of a psychic journey together to test your own innate psychic abilities. This is a fun one. Oh, I can't wait. Okay, so having said that, let's start off with what's weird this week, and we'll get into the psychic test. Give me one moment. All right, this doesn't take long, so you won't need to set aside a whole lot of time to do it. It's just a quick exercise. I also want to give credit where credit is due before we jump into the psychic test. I found this on a site called Saya and Underworld many years ago, and I absolutely loved this. It is very in vogue with a lot of ancient Japanese ghost-telling traditions. There's actually a story that they used to play, and still do in Japan. It's a ghost-telling competition where you light 100 candles, and after every ghost story told, you are meant to put out a candle so it gets progressively darker where you're telling stories, and the stories are meant to get progressively scarier as the darker it gets. So, it's meant to get progressively scarier the darker it gets with the stories you're telling, so that finally, when you put out the last candle, allegedly, according to this ghost storytelling ritual, I believe it's called Hyaku Monogatari. I may have that wrong, probably. But allegedly, after putting out the last candle, from telling the very last story, it's meant to conjure all the ghosts that you've told stories about throughout the whole night. So it's sort of a test of courage type deal. It's also a storytelling convention, which I absolutely love. Tests of courage, as far as the paranormal go, are very ingrained into youth culture over there. We kind of have a Western equivalent, which I believe is called kimo demeshi in Japan. There's an English word for it, too, that's more academic sounding. I'd have to look back into my urban legend studies to find it, but it's pretty much the same thing as visiting the sites of urban legends and graveyards, etc., places that are meant to be haunted. It's sort of just a test of courage. So, but having said that, I highly recommend the site Saya and Underworld. It is a one-stop shop for all things Japanese urban legends, ghost stories, and so forth. So, having gotten that out of the way, let's begin the psychic test. You need to find a place in your home that's quiet, where you can close your eyes and sit there. Now, I guess I should also preface this by saying that you might not want to do this with your own house. You may want to think of the house that you grew up in. That's what they recommend. I will say that there is a paranormal angle to this, so fair warning. So, got your quiet place. Close your eyes. Let's say you're picturing the house that you grew up in, because we'll say that's safer. So, yes. Think of yourself in your room where you used to live, and stand up in your vision and walk around the house. Go from room to room and look within every room. Muster as much detail and vivid imagery as you can. Use your memory to the best of your ability and look around the house. The kitchen, the living room, dining room, bedrooms, bathrooms, etc. You've looked at them all. Now, return to the room that you started in, sit back down, open your eyes, you're back in the real world. Now, the psychic test works like this. Did you see any people while you were looking around your house? If you saw no one whatsoever, then you have next to little or no psychic ability. However, if you saw friends or family in your house, moving about in your memories and your image conjuring within your mind, that means you're probably at about 80%, I believe it is, psychic ability, strong sense impressions, I believe what they call the equivalent of a residual haunting, except this is people who may or may not still be alive, but it also means that you have a close tie to your friends and family. You're probably a good host, you like to entertain, things like this. Now, if you saw strangers, people whose faces you've never seen before, that was probably a ghost. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but there could be history to the grounds that you were walking that, you don't really know the full story behind. So that's at about a 90 to 100, I believe. And if you saw anything akin to, let's say, a white mist or a black blob or some sort of entity that you couldn't quite piece together, something that was very nebulous and only sort of kind of looked human, that's bad. You need to avoid that spot at all costs. And here's the kicker. This is why I wanted to do this. If you saw ghosts, or if you saw anything that could be classified as an other entity otherwise, well, having seen them, that means they've most likely seen you. And they are aware that you've seen them and are aware of your presence. So you might want to get checked out by a priest or a shaman or a sorcerer of some kind. If you did see any of the black blobs or white mists or what have you, and avoid that place at all costs. Unless you still live there, which I recommended not to do. But if you did, you might want to think about a cleansing of some kind. So, yeah, that's what's weird for this week. All right, moving from there into today's main subject, we're talking about a man by the name of Abe No Seimei. Like I said, he was the Japanese equivalent of Merlin, except he was a true and real historical figure. He was a practitioner of what's known as, and I want to make sure I get these right, Onmyodo. So practitioners of Onmyodo were known as Onmyoji. So Abe No Seimei would be an Onmyoji. And the Onmyoji worked for a government bureau known as the Onmyodo, which means the Yin and Yang Bureau. Now, Onmyodo is essentially one of the first, I would say, judging from modern occult standards, basically, that Onmyodo is probably one of the first full-on forms of chaos magic, I would say, because it incorporates and utilizes a whole vast grab bag of just different sources. And once again, as with chaos magic, it's all about what's the most effective. So you're talking Buddhism, Shintoism, Daoism is a big part of it. There's some Confucianism in there. Exorcism, astrology, Eastern alchemy, which has two forms. There's inner alchemy and outer alchemy. Very interesting Eastern alchemy. There is an interplay between Western alchemy. I see that Western alchemy is very much, it revolves a lot around symbology and the meanings and mysteries behind a lot of the symbology, whereas Eastern alchemy is either sexual in nature or biological in nature, which those two are kind of intertwined, or it has to do with literal, like, mixing of chemicals and precursor to chemistry as we know it today. And then they also did things like find lost items for people. They, did ritual purifications. A lot of it has to do with geomancy as well. So where to build a house, or if a house was left on its own for a while and no one lived there, it kind of automatically became a storehouse for spirits, whether they be good or bad, or yokai, which are basically monsters. But once again, I would equate them to the modern day cryptid. Whereas with cryptids today, we still don't know, are these physical beings? Are these, interdimensional beings? Are these, half spirit, half physical beings, etc.? So I would say it's the same camp, basically. I would almost say, actually, that the yokai are the number one precursor to most cryptids as we know them today. And they do have their equivalents of Bigfoot, things like that. So a lot of crossover. But yeah, ritual purifications of empty houses, or using feng shui, the most popular known Eastern form of geomancy, is essentially used to figure out where to build houses, palaces, temples, things like that. It's intertwined pretty deeply with sacred geometry and sacred architecture. There are 4 guardians of the cardinal points that must be appeased, and they sort of correspond to mountains, roads, water, and trees. Then you've got what's known as Wu Jing, which is an awesome sort of Eastern interpretation of the 5 elements. But what I love about Wu Jing, as opposed to the Eastern 5 elements, those being earth, air, water, fire, and spirit, or aether, over there, it's fire, water, earth, metal, and wood. And the cool thing about Wu Jing is there's sort of an interplay between these elements that's almost like a built-in sort of, it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors. I know that's probably a gross oversimplification, but there are ways that one element affects another. So let's say fire destroys wood. Wood becomes earth after being burned. Metal can be used to dig into earth, but metal also collects dew and water in the morning. Fire can be used to forge metal. Metal can be used to chop down wood. Wood can be used to dam water. So there's all this sort of interplay between these 5 elements that creates a sort of synergistic principle that is used to essentially conjure various energies, elemental forces, etc., for various uses. Now, Abe No Seimei, he is also known as the Japanese equivalent to Merlin, mostly because of his backstory. And he was one of the most popular of the Onmyodo. The Onmyodo, the Yin and Yang Bureau, was essentially started by academics who were into the occult and various spiritual practices, essentially. And they decided to start a government bureau which sort of worked hand in hand with the emperor's family, because this is also a time, remember, that the emperor and his family, or her family, were gods on earth. So they are all descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. And I have my own sort of weird theory. I don't necessarily think it's true, maybe, but if you take the imagery of the black sun, which is mostly equated with Nazi occultism, but I'm taking it back, because fuck them, first of all. And second of all, the black sun has appeared in numerous other spiritual practices and mythologies and folklore. It's big in alchemy, and it's also a huge factor in the fifth son of sort of Mesoamerican Aztec mythology. So there's also the Indian astrology figure known as Rahu, who is basically a giant dragon's head that flies around space and eats the sun or the moon and causes eclipses. This also plays into a later bit of folklore and mythology that comes from China. There is a heavenly dog, which is like the guardian of the gates of heaven, called Tiangu, which is basically a flying dog head that also eats the sun or the moon. And somehow, most of the folklore that I look into, no one can really figure out how this etymological transformation really occurred. But Tiangu, heavenly dog, somehow traveled to Japan and became Tengu. And the Tengu are a race of basically, there's two kinds of Tengu. There's a race of what are essentially long-nosed mountain wizards. And then there's another kind of Tengu that are like birdmen. They're all like ravens and crows. They're very strongly associated with shamanism and ninja practices, primarily stealth practices, etc. So there's a lot of overlap in these. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier with the cultural interplay. Not all of the folklore can be traced accurately or properly, but there are many numerous stories about Tengu, whether it be the mountain wizards, which are basically, they're kind of based off of a real sect, which I believe are called the Yamabushi, who are literally like mountain hermit aesthetic wizards that, you know, they fuck off to the mountains and practice magic. And then you have the Kurasu Tengu, which means like crow Tengu. The crow is another sort of, much like the fox, which we'll get into later, or the dog also. Dogs and canids in general are going to play a lot into this. But the crow, specifically a three-legged crow, is alleged to have brought the sun forth in ancient Japanese mythology, but there are also strange connections to Odin's raven, which I find weird. And there's a lot of, I think most mythographers, I believe they're called, and folklorists, etc., they base a lot of what I'm about to share with you on the fact that there are connections between ancient Indian Hindu mythology and folklore with ancient Germanic folklores. The biggest connection that most people have found so far is that in Hinduism and Buddhism, there is a class of deity. They've also been kind of likened to demigods or demons or the titans of Greek myth, but they're called the Asura. And there has been some connections made into Germanic mythology with one of their breeds of god. There's two gods, or two, I guess, races of gods, the Vanir and the Aesir. And there's actually been sort of these Indo-Aryan, not that kind, Eastern Hindu to, Hindu to European mythology exchange somewhere way, way back in the day, they think. And that's why you see some of these recurring names that show up. And once again, back to the black sun idea, that, you know, like I said, it shows up in Hindu mythology, and then there are references to it in Nordic and Norse mythology as well, which was appropriated by the fucking Nazis, unfortunately. But I'm taking it back. But, however, I have my own weird theory that plays into some of the more esoteric stories about turn of the century militant fascist groups in Japan, such as the Black Dragon Society or Black Ocean or the Green Dragon Society. Some of these groups, specifically the Green Dragon Society, are a little more disputed in whether they existed or not. The sources of where these groups, specifically Green Dragon Society, came from can be a little dubious because some of it comes from fiction and some of it comes from sort of the equivalent of urban legends of the day, folklore of the time. However, my own weird theory is that I think there may be some kind of reverse, let's see how to put this. You have the royal family, the emperor and his family, who are descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Now, I guess, for lack of a better term, the bad guy in most Japanese mythology, the god of chaos, if you will, his name is Amatsu Mikaboshi, and he's like a star god / god of the cosmic void. So I have a weird theory that maybe there's like a reverse shadow emperor family, for lack of a better term. I don't know. This is sort of something I played around with fictionally, but the more I started looking into the various orders of what is essentially Japanese Freemasonry and all the sort of royal orders, and the more I started thinking about things like certain forms of Satanism or Diabolism or Luciferianism, whatever you want to call it, as the B team, the Black Ops team to Christianity, like the sort of the side with all of the disavowed responsibility, the side with plausible deniability, I don't know, the more I thought about it, I was like, it's possible. So, I don't know, that's just one of my own weird little theories that I got out of kind of like looking at this mythology and sort of, I don't know, immersing myself in it. I don't necessarily believe that to be true, but maybe something akin to that. I don't know, I'm probably way off the mark on that. But that's one of my own weird little theories about the importance and the applications of myth and folklore as we know it today. It's kind of like, it's equivalent to ideas of like the Saturn death cult, basically. I don't know. It's something I'm still fleshing out, but I'm throwing it out there because maybe someone else will know some stuff that either totally fucking negates it or can strengthen the argument. So we'll see. But yes, back to Abe No Seimei. The Onmyodo Bureau of Yin and Yang was started to work hand in hand with the emperor and their family, being that they were divinities on Earth, essentially. Much like in the West, how fucking kings and queens have long said, you know, divine right to rule, etc. It's the same thing, except they're straight up coming out and saying, like, we are gods on the Earth. So at least they had the balls to take it to its natural fucking conclusion and say it out loud and in the open. Anywho, the Onmyodo Bureau was started to help work hand in hand with them and to help regular folk, like I said, by, you know, purifying locations, using geomancy to find the best places to build a house, finding lost objects, exorcising evil spirits, locating monsters and helping people hunt them down to kill them, etc. Things of this nature. The reason that Abe No Seimei specifically was given the parallel of the Japanese equivalent to Merlin is because his mother is a figure who figures, she's a huge folkloric figure. Her name is Kuzunoha, and she's a nine-tailed, shape-shifting foxwoman. And they have these beings in Japanese folklore and myth called the kitsune, which just mean fox, but I believe it's kitsune buki. I believe that's it. I think I'm saying that right. Kitsune buki, which were the fox women. I guess the closest Western equivalent would be a succubus, because they're these shape-shifting figures that are half physical, half spirit, but they're all like hot women, basically, which is probably where the term foxy comes from. I would not doubt it. But yeah, seeing as these are folklorical figures, there's a lot of mystical ability attributed to the fox, And also, one of the chief Shinto deities, Inari, is a fox deity who is also a god or goddess, of fertility and rice and a lot of really important shit, basically, to people throughout time in Japan. So, whether there's a connection between these shape-shifting fox spirits and the goddess Inari is somewhat left vaguely untouched. I've never really seen a lot of comparison or contrasting with the two. They hardly ever get brought up together, but once again, the fox was given special attributions of spirit and or demonic power, as well as witchery. There were certain forms of sorcerers and exorcists who kind of are equivalent to the Western version of the clever folk throughout most of Europe, largely in Britain. Once again, kind of like these backwoods magicians who could be good or bad. Most of the ones in the West were burned and were women, so didn't really work out well for a lot of them. But there supposedly are these like secret wars and rivalries between certain family clans who were attributed to have workings or use as familiars these fox spirits. And then you have other clans that were using other spirits as well, like the Bakeneko, which is sort of a shape-shifting cat. Foxes and cats were both attributed these sort of supernatural abilities because of some of the noises they'd make. If you listen to my last audio I dropped, then you can hear how if you were to stumble across a fox or a talking cat in the middle of the night, it would freak you the fuck out, most definitely. So there's those associations. But then you also have associations with what are known as tanuki, which is a raccoon dog that generally is said to have massive testicles. The tanuki is more of the fun-loving trickster spirit out of all these. I mean, they are all trickster spirits. But then you have one that gets a bit darker, and I'll go into why. And if you're an animal lover, specifically of dogs, you may want to skip ahead a little bit. But there are also what's known as the inugami spirits, which may also have relations back to the Tiangu, from China, the heavenly dog. But these are more in line with black magic practices of how to create a familiar from a dog spirit. And there's a lot of literature and history throughout time of people being possessed by these spirits. I think this is kind of how they dealt with mental illness a lot back in the day before medicine really picked up. People were, said to be possessed or taken over by fox spirits or inugami dog spirits. And this is the part where if you're a dog lover, you might want to skip ahead. The ritual that was done to create a familiar inugami spirit was to take a dog, generally a black dog, which is also in the West largely associated with, hellhounds and phantom dogs and things like that. And I don't even want to say this really, but it's the black magic ritual, so we'll get it out there. You're meant to bury the dog up to its head and then put food in front of it just out of reach. And basically you fucking whip this dog up into a frenzy, and at some point at the height of the frenzy, when the dog is like really just almost at a point of savagery, you're supposed to kill the dog. And then you decapitate it. And what they would do afterwards is they would take the dog's head and sort of affix it to a shrine somewhere in their house. And essentially by placating the spirit of the dog with food and things like that afterwards, it essentially like won it over to you. And this is how you created a familiar spirit for yourself. So I'm just picturing like crazy dog skeleton shrines hidden away in people's houses. And that's how it was. That's how it worked. They had these crazy weird shrines just hidden away like under the floorboards or in some secret place of their house in order to, continuously upkeep and care for their familiar dog spirit, their inugami spirit. And you had these inugami masters who were able to sick their familiar spirit on people, or send it away to possess them, or they could become possessed themselves, but they were able to control it and use like the spirit's strength, etc. There's also a sort of addendum that the dog's body, if it was buried under a heavy crosswalk, like anywhere that there was tons of traffic, that was supposed to make the dog even more like whipped up in a frenzy, like the dog's spirit. So there could be, in high traffic areas, ancient dog bodies buried underneath major metropolitan crosswalks. Who knows? But I digress. So, yeah, and there are connections to, like I said, not just witches and spirits and succubi or incubi or whatever, but you also have the obvious, we're talking canids here. So you have the lycanthropy argument as well. And there's actually some stories that I've found online about GIs during World War II, and a few in Vietnam, because Vietnam has a corresponding fox spirit figure like this called the Huli Jing. And these stories about GIs encountering these weird fox-eyed women and fox cannibal people and just weird shit. It's really worth looking into. I hesitate to throw them on this episode because I don't know the veracity of some. It's very hard to find out. These are just sort of, essentially cryptid encounters that happened during the wars. So if you like supernatural stories of horror and weirdness that overlap with war and happen to soldiers, which I do, there is a channel on YouTube called Wartime Stories that I highly recommend. It is all stories from soldiers about weird shit that's happened during the war, or, tangentially related thereof. So really worth checking out. But yeah, so you have the werewolf angle as well, and this sort of plays in with different forms of shamanism and, totem animals and things like that. So there is that connection. But one of the most famous fox spirits, Kuzunoha, was said to be Abe no Seimei's mother. And the reason that he gets the equivalency of being the Japanese Merlin is because Merlin's mother was human, but his father was a demon. And nobody really talks about that in a lot of Arthurian legend stuff. Merlin had a much more central role in all of the Arthurian Grail mythology and folklore. And then the more Christianized that Europe became, he sort of started taking a back seat to a lot of what was going on, even though he essentially masterminded the birth of Arthur and is responsible for, almost, I'd say 80% of moving all the story forward and a lot of that shit. So, but they downplayed his role in a much larger way once Christianity became a bigger factor to those stories. There's one more quick Shinto god, and I guess it would be Shinto, but the reason I'm hesitant to say that is because there is an indigenous people of Japan known as the Ainu clan, which basically translates to dog people, and so there's another weird connection. But they have a god, like all the gods in Shinto are known as kami. So they're like a cross between spirits and gods, somewhere in between. I would equate a lot of them to what is known in Greek mythology as genius loci. It's a spirit of place. It's the intelligence or elemental force that oversees a specific area, and that's why you see shrines built up in the mountains and large parts of nature, and why the Shinto religion is largely animist, which means it believes in spirits that inhabit everything. It's very much born out of shamanism, which is quite obvious really when you think about it and sort of see where the temples are located, where the shrines are located, the inari. Those are the sort of the big pie, the pie symbol shaped gates are they're called inari, and they're, sort of doorways into the territory of spirits, if you will. quick correction from the future. They're not called Inari. They're called Torii or Torii. But yeah, the Ainu people, they have a different name for their spirit gods. That's Kamui, not Kami, but you can see the etymological connection. But one of their specific gods is called Akoro Kumui. And this is an octopus god. Sound familiar already? An octopus god that is worshipped predominantly by deformed people. And the reason for that is because octopi are able to grow their limbs back if they've been in an accident. And that's why that's why deformed people sort of eventually made this connection in ancient times to revere this god and make offerings to this giant octopus god, because if the god looked upon them, with favor, they would at least survive whatever accident that deformed them, or, hopefully, I don't think they're going to be growing a lot of limbs back, but who knows? Medicine and its mysteries throughout history are vast and strange. So yeah, I just thought it was weird that there's a octopus god that is predominantly worshipped by disfigured people. If that's not historical and spiritual nightmare fuel, I don't know what it is. That's where it took me when I heard it. So I don't know. But at the same time, I totally get the thought process behind it. And, a lot of shamanism and all the religions that are born out of it, that spun out of it one way or another, it's just another form of medicine. That's all it is. So that's why, your spirit practitioners have always been called medicine men and things like that, or women throughout time. So yeah, it's just meant to be another way of healing. And a lot of especially in Japan, a lot of evil spirits are closely associated with plague and disease and filth. In fact, there's several yokai that I wanted to mention who are perfect examples of this. I don't remember the Japanese name for this one, but it translates to essentially filth liquor. And it's a sort of demon spirit that hangs out in bathrooms and just sort of like licks the base of the toilet and things like this. It just crawls around your house and like eats the filth. So it's incentive to keep a fucking, obviously a clean, nice house. There was another one called Shirime, I think it's called. And this is essentially a featureless human being who walks around backwards and has an eyeball in its asshole. So basically, if you took the whole Ace Ventura routine of, may I ask you a question? Yeah, just picture that, but having no face and walking around backwards and just flapping their butt cheeks open with an eyeball staring at you. Pretty unsettling. Really unwholesome. There is another figure called the Napper Abo. Now, this isn't necessarily related to all the bathroomness or whatever, but I would say that Napper Abo is 100% the precursor to Slender Man, because this is just, it looks like a regular person, and like the stories that they're involved in is you walk up behind them and you say their name, or you think it's someone you know, and they turn around, and as soon as you see them, no face. No fucking face. So that's like a reoccurring, like, just weird fear, because you meet strangers on the road, and normally you would talk and converse to each other like, hey, how you doing, where you going? But when someone turns around, no face, you freak the fuck out and run the opposite way. So, and this no face thing is going to come back later, because I've got another little story I want to tell that has to do with Daoist Chinese mythology here later. So yeah. Back to Abe No Seimei, he was born out of, strange magical congruences of basically just a hybrid of man and spirit, essentially. And this was thought to give him an extra boost in power. And I did say he was the most popular of the Onmyodo. That's sort of true. He was trained by a precursor named Yasunori no Kamo. And the Kamo family was like the fucking championship dynasty Onmyoji of the Onmyodo Bureau. And what's weird, too, is the Onmyodo Bureau only started out with 6 agents working for it, but it soon just inflated to great, great numbers because, and this is why, this is the problem with having an occult government, is that everyone becomes too fucking reliant upon it. This is what happened in real life and why the Onmyodo Bureau eventually was done away with, because people could not make their own decisions about anything without consulting the Onmyodo Bureau. So, you know, even of like, where can I plant my garden and just everything, every little thing you could think of, people were constantly, you know, harping on the magic forces at hand. And that's why, you know, if Ouija boards and stuff like that didn't already have a bad rap of, you know, unleashing demonic powers, blah, 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 whatever. Even if you were to successfully and, you know, unhaphazardly be able to use a Ouija board or any form of occultism, really, that's where the problem eventually comes in, is that in the West, you constantly hear in, you know, occult circles and occult literature about people either A, becoming like, oh, I'm a sorcerer, and I know the secrets of your butthole, or whatever, just whatever dumb thing. And then B, people becoming far too reliant upon, you know, spiritual powers. And I've said before, this goes with aliens and spirits and communications with them. They're notorious liars as well. They're bullshitters. And maybe not to their own fault. I don't know. I'm still sort of looking at a lot of folklore and myth and literature on these things. I don't know if they can help lying or not. But I'm still looking into that. That's an idea in progress. So two of the more famous stories about Abe No Seimei himself. One was that he helped locate one of the most notorious and monstrous demons to ever terrorize Japan, known as the Shuten Doji. This was a monster that was abducting women and children and eating them. He helped put a stop to that. He also had a rival sorcerer named Domon, and Domon and him got into a straight up like Merlin versus Madame Mim style prestidigitation rap battle, essentially. And Domon thought he was going to trick Abe No Seimei by switching the number of oranges in a box and saying, guess how many oranges are in this box? And Abe No Seimei said, yeah, sure, whatever, dude. And he fucking did his little magic trick and turned all the oranges into rats so that when Domon opened the box, he was covered with rats. And yeah, I don't know. That's lateral thinking if I've ever seen it in practice. Oh boy. But yeah, that's kind of the most I have for Abe No Seimei. There are more stories about him, and there are writings attributed to him, but he's kind of my springboard into some of this stuff. And some of the sort of tools of the trade of the Onmyoji, one specifically is known as shikigami. And shikigami is essentially creating familiars out of paper. So you create these little paper dolls and they would do things for you. They could run reconnaissance, they could spy, hide out, they could steal things for you, etc. There's a long tradition of sort of not only connections with voodoo dolls and sort of simulacra magic, but also throughout Daoism you have a lot of Daoist paper magic and sort of the creation of talismans with symbols throughout that can sort of, you could see sort of a progression into the creation of shikigami out of these two. Another tool of the trade that they often conjured was called a Gohan Doji, which is sort of equivalent to a Buddhist Dharmapala or Dharma Guardian. These are meant to be like ferocious, demonic, evil-looking spirits, they're fucking badass and scary and cool looking, but they're meant to be guardians of the Dharma. So they have to be badass and scary and cool looking. Like, a lot of the stories behind them are that they were formerly demons who were basically, and this is one of the things I love about Buddhism as a religion, is that demons can be saved. They're not just like forever fucked. I don't know, you can repent as a demon and then bring your badass demon shit to the fore as a warrior for good or whatever. And that's where a lot of the Dharmopolis come from. They're like ancient gods or demons who sort of found enlightenment through Buddhism and were like, yeah, fucking, I'm down with this shit. And they are ride or die. So the Gohan Doji specifically is essentially like a little demon child that flies around on a flying Dharma wheel and has a fucking badass like necklace made of swords and daggers and shit, and is super badass looking. I would suggest looking it up. Gohondoji. Shikigami, if you want to look at some of those, Shikigami. Not to be confused with Shinigami, which is the Japanese equivalent of the Grim Reaper, which basically translates directly into death gods. So they have multiple god-level Grim Reaper psychopomp type figures who are there to take your soul off to the afterworld. So yeah, a lot of this stuff, if you look up things like Shinigami, you're probably going to find a lot of anime-related stuff. I mentioned an anime earlier called Doomed Megalopolis, which is one of those fucking awesome late 80s, early 90s anime that has just weird, crazy imagery and is violent, but not too weird. You know what I mean. If you would like to see the first ever historical instance of tentacle porn, I would suggest looking up a print from the late 1800s called The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife. That is the first known instance of tentacle porn, late 1800s. Who'd have thought, huh? Anyways, Doomed Megalopolis is actually based on a book that came out in the 1980s called Taito Monogatari, which basically means the story of Tokyo, which used to be called Taito, or there's a translation error I'm not quite getting, but I believe that's how it works. The story of Taito Monogatari there's no English translation. The closest you can get is the Doomed Megalopolis anime, or there's a live action movie made that under the same name that also had all of its creatures and special effects work designed by H.R. Geiger. So, worth checking out. There are no English dubs of it, I don't think, the live action, but reading subtitles never hurt anyone. It's worth it. So yeah, the story came out in the 1980s, and basically long ago, after the Onmyodo was closed down, it didn't see any popular resurgence till about the 1800s, which is known as the Edo period in Japan, and that was very brief. And then you come to the 1980s, when I don't have the author's name on me, but I do now in the future, and his name is Hiroshi Aramata. The Taito Monogatari series sort of repopularized Onmyoji and Onmyodo practices, and specifically Abe No Seimei. So nowadays, you'll see all kinds of anime and manga and various TV shows, etc., with Abe No Seimei as the main character. They've done like gender flip versions. There's probably like some cute animal versions, I'm sure. So, yeah. But the cool thing about that book, and I'm hoping they do an English translation, is that it's essentially an occult conspiracy theory alternative history. And it incorporates various real-life historical figures, some of whom were long dead, but, maybe were secretly long-lived, like Abe No Seimei, who was, of course, half-spirit, so who knows. But, yeah, it incorporates all these fringe characters who are real historical figures, but who were known as psychics and mediums, etc., all throughout. And essentially, the main underlying story is that there's there's an evil spirit or an angry god spirit of sorts, an angry kami, if you will, buried underneath Tokyo. And this is true, actually. There's a former warlord who was decapitated and his body was desecrated. And in order to appease his spirit, he was such a furious and powerful warrior in real life that they were already scared shitless of like what his spirit might do. So in order to do that, or to appease the spirit, they basically granted godhood to his spirit, and his head is buried under a major metropolitan area in modern-day Tokyo. It's been there forever. And the main villain, the antagonist of the story, is named Yasunori Kato. So if you remember the other Onmyodo I mentioned earlier, Yasunori Kamo, that's where they got the name. But you will recognize, I'm sure, instantaneously Yasunori Kato if you saw him, because he is the visual representation behind M. Bison from Street Fighter. Basically any character you've ever seen that looks sort of, that is dressed very pseudo-Nazi, this is the character that visual representation is based on. There is a manga artist by the name of Suehiro Maruo. I highly recommend checking out some of his work. It's not just anime manga influenced. It has this very strong 1920s German expressionist film sort of influence on it. And a lot of it is weird as fuck and gruesome. I won't say necessarily outright pornographic. I'm sure there is some, but a general Google search will just show you, you know, the basics, and a lot of it is fucking badass. And he did some of the artwork for the Teito Monogatari books, so there's some overlap there. But yeah, Suehiro Maruo, one of my favorites. There's also, and this is actually somewhat tangentially related to both Abe No Seimei and recent events in Japan, maybe, possibly, but Kuzunoha, the fox spirit, who was Abe no Seimei's mother, was eventually trapped within a rock. Her spirit was trapped inside of a rock by a sorcerer or exorcist, and the rock became known as the Killing Stone, and it became a major tourist attraction in Japan for forever, until, I believe, in March of 2022, the stone finally somehow just split open all its own. It wasn't hit by lightning. No drunk tourist hit it with the car. It just went crack and opened up like a fucking egg. So people are, you know, since then wondering like, oh shit, Kuzunoha, is she loose? I'm pretty sure it's Kuzunoha. There's another famous fox spirit named Tamama no Mei, who is a 9-tailed fox spirit. And supposedly the more tails you have, you know, the longer you've been around, the more powerful you are, etc. Yeah, there's one more element of this Eastern occultism that I wanted to talk about. And this plays into some of my own theories that I was mentioning earlier, specifically socio-political theories. There is a form of magic and occultism that's known as Gu in China, Gu, or Ku, or Kodoku. And essentially what this is, and some of you may have heard about it, I've probably mentioned it before on older episodes, but what it is essentially you take several venomous animals. Usually it's like a lizard, a frog, a snake, a centipede, spiders, scorpions, etc. You take all these poisonous animals and you put them in a special jar, like a ritual jar. And essentially they fucking fight it out until there's only one survivor. And from that survivor, you're supposed to harness the venom. And because it survived, you know, or ate whatever else was in the jar with it, essentially its venom is supposed to be made way stronger. Now, this model of magic can be used to essentially perform mind control. It was used in a lot of sex magic, as mostly as a Like this will get someone to secretly fall in love with you if you apply it right. Things like that. Or just as fucking in the black arts of assassination. So there's that as well. However, this particular model of occultism, I see a lot of parallels with specifically our prison system. But I don't know. There's something about just the forced incarceration, maybe even ritual incarceration of venomous predators in order to essentially foster conflict among them, create a dog-eat-dog environment, if you will, and have one lone survivor become the most intensely poisonous, deadliest new life form, essentially, because that's what it is. It's a new form of venom, a new concentrated toxin. I don't know. I just see a lot of parallels with, I don't know. It's, maybe you've heard me say this before too, but I think they called the projects a project for a reason, because somebody's got a project going. That's just my paranoid conspiracy brain working, though. However, this ku or kodoku or gu magic goes way further. As a matter of fact, I've got a bit of an excerpt here from classic kook magician Kenneth Grant, who I've definitely mentioned on the show before. He's a disciple of Aleister Crowley. He's probably one of the more imaginative occultists that's been around in a while. But he talks about, in his book, Cults of the Shadow, the cult of the ku. And I wanted to read a little excerpt because this just goes into some crazy fucking places. So, Cult of the Ku flourished in London in the 1920s. Its headquarters may have been in Peking. Austin Osman Spare, who was associated with this group, allegedly, according to Grant, never said. Perhaps he did not know. But its London offshoot was not in Limehouse, as one might have expected, but in Stockwell, not far from a studio flat that Spare shared with a friend. A secret session of the Cult of the Ku was witnessed by Spare, who seems to have been the only European ever to have gained admittance. He does, in fact, seem to have been the only European, apart from an individual named Burke, who had no prior knowledge of the cult. Spare's experience is of exceptional interest by reason of its approximation to a form of dream control into which he was initiated many years earlier by a witch named Patterson. The word ku has several meanings in Chinese, but in this particular case, it denotes a peculiar form of sorcery involving elements which Spare had already incorporated in his conception of the new sexuality. The adepts of ku worshipped a serpent goddess in the form of a woman dedicated to the cult. During an elaborate ritual, she would become possessed, which the result that she threw off or emanated multiple forms of the goddess as sentient shadows endowed with all the charms possessed by her human representative. These shadow women, impelled by some subtle law of attraction, gravitated to one or other of the devotees who sat in a drowsy condition around the entranced priestess. Sexual congress with these shadows then occurred, and it was the beginnings of a sinister form of dream control involving journeys and encounters in infernal regions. The ku would seem to be a form of fire snake exteriorized astrally as a shadow woman or succubus, congress with which enabled the devotee to reify his inherent dream. She was known as the Whore of Hell. Wow. And her function was analogous to that of the Scarlet Woman of Crowley's cult, the Suvaini. This is a bad copy, sorry, of the Tantric Kaula Circle, and the fiendess of the Cult of the Black Snake. The Chinese ku, or Harlot of Hell, is a shadowy embodiment of subconscious desires concentrated in the alluringly sensuous form of the serpent or shadow goddess. This cult I'd first heard of through the writings of Colin Wilson in his awesome book, The Occult, which you've never read. I highly recommend you do. But I'm not sure if this was his lone source on Kenneth Grant's take on the cult of the coup, but there was also some strange connections to not just shadow entities, as we've just heard, but UFOs as well, as allegedly some of these practitioners of this coup magic were able to astrally project their consciousness in what was largely described as a UFO form. So there you have another potential alternate narrative behind UFO sightings, and that these could be the astrally projected spirits of sorcerers or black magicians, if you will. Yeah, strange stuff. And if you're ever looking for just a dose of weird as fuck, I also highly recommend reading some Kenneth Grant. Okay, so I had one last bit of Daoist mythology I wanted to sort of dip into. And what I meant by sort of building your own inner mythology, a lot of the stuff I mentioned has sort of informed my own inner worldview of what I mean by attaching yourself to a mythology. A lot of the dog and star symbolism, and the dog star and Sirius and its place in occultism, like, I don't know, there's just all these connections you can make that can sort of always be brought back around into a relation to yourself, and it's sort of finding your own U-shaped hole in the cosmology and mythology and folklore of the world. And how a lot of it is connected. I mean, it's not just monomyths either, like the flood or, what's another one? People from the sea showing up and civilizing society. So those two are kind of interrelated. Or one of my favorite versions of the monomyth, what's known as Chaos Kampf, which is basically a reoccurring theme you see throughout most mythologies, where a storm god, who's usually like the chief deity, is fighting a chaos monster, a dragon of some sort. So you have like, Thor versus the world dragon, Jormungandr, or you have Michael the Archangel fighting Leviathan or Satan, or Saint George fighting the dragon, or Indra fighting Vritra. This is just a reoccurring thing that shows up in so many mythologies. And the more I look at it, really, and a lot of the behaviors of these chief storm deities, like specifically, I'm looking at you, Zeus, when you fought Typhon. But we all know Zeus was a fucking rapist and a scumbag. But he was the big daddy, the big sky daddy. And I don't know, the more I look at mythologies, there's sort of this, in Japan specifically, their storm god, their equivalent to Thor, is called Susanoo-o, who fought the Yamato no Orochi, the 8-headed dragon. Fuck yeah, rock on, 8 points of chaos. So these storm deities are very... they're mostly assholes, really. They're notorious assholes. Anyone who's in control of the thunder and lightning, like bar Indra, I think, from Hindu mythology, I haven't really seen anything about him being a fucking asshole, but most of them are known for being pig-headed or just not really pleasant people, and causing chaos to quite a degree in themselves. So the whole idea of Chaos Kampf, I know it wasn't intended to be taken this way, but I'm seeing like two opposing forms of chaos dueling it out. Weather was, way back in the day, probably is one of the most chaotic forces you can get. And then, of course, you're talking like primordial chaos monsters like 8-headed dragons and Cthulhu-type beings. So there's that as well. This is a sort of Daoist creation myth to a degree, but it's not a myth. And there are several ways to interpret this story, but I will try to remember them all once done. I got this from an awesome YouTube channel called, Philosophy in Motion. And we're going to close out also with a bit of a true crime adjacent sort of thing that I found on there as well. But yeah, the story of Hundun, he's a faceless primordial chaos being personified, and he's also known as the Emperor of the Center. And one day he invites the Emperor of the North Sea, whose name was Fast, and the Emperor of the South Sea, whose name was Furious. In some translations, it's Quick, but we'll go with Fast and Furious because it's just easy to remember. Anywho, so he invites Emperor Fast and Emperor Furious to the center, and they have a meal. And they want to thank Hundun for his generosity and being a good host. So they look at him and they realize, hey, he's got no face. Let's drill some holes in his face and make him like us. And after the 7 holes in his face, 1 ear, 2 ear, 1 eye, 2 eye, 1 nostril, and the mouth, 7 holes. After 7 days of drilling 7 holes, Hundun fucking dies. Now, the interpretations of this pseudo-myth, and I start with pseudo-myth because one of the interpretations of this story is to not too strongly identify with false myths or religions. And that's why you must also keep a very cautiously optimistic approach to things like occultism or spirituality or religion. In anything, I think. Anything of that nature, that's going to be your best way to approach it. The reason that they refer to this story as a pseudo-myth or a false myth is because of the way that it is structured. It's meant to sound like it's going to be sort of a creation story, but then it subverts the audience's expectations into becoming a bit of a satirical stand-up version of mythology. Another way to interpret this story is the social critique version, where because of the reciprocity of generousness that Fast and Furious show, they end up killing Hundun. But this is also kind of meant to show that a reciprocal nature of generosity or, gift giving, being a good host, things like that, and just social interaction in general. The idea of social reciprocity can build a form of dependence, and that is no good. And then the probably most important interpretation of this story is the social critique theory that basically says that Fast and Furious wanted Hundun to be like them. They wanted him to conform to their standards. And this has to do with both people and nature. Mankind, human beings, are by their very nature anthropocentric. We consider mankind to be the end-all be-all. We consider it to be the measure of all things, and we tend to try to make nature conform to that. So this not only has a bit of an ecological message, but there's the whole idea of us versus them, and interventionist politics and warfare. It's why people are constantly throughout history trying to get other people to conform to their standards of what it is to be human, whether that be religious, political, etc. That's sort of the main takeaway from this story, I think. The most important one, at least. There is no us or them. It's all just people. We're all trying our best, goddammit. So yeah. I have one last thing. I'm actually going to read verbatim. I know that I try not to read as much as possible on here, but I did sort of jazz it up a little. We're going to close out with something that I think is surprisingly, it's full of surprisingly contemporary wisdom from something that was written in China centuries and centuries ago. There's information in here that is perfectly in line, I would say, with not just things like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, but Western philosophies and quandaries on the nature of power and community and several other concepts that you will see. But I would say that what you're about to hear is important and belongs right up there with previously published contemplations on such things as political power, community, etc., right alongside Machiavelli, the 48 Laws of Power, and or, only built for Cuban links. So this is called the Tao of Gangsters, and it goes like this. The Tao of Gangsters. Gangsta G was asked by one of his gang members, "Do gangsters have their Tao too?" G replied, "How could they get anywhere without their Tao? Having a hunch where something is hidden? That's sagely. Going in first? That's courageous. Leaving last? That's righteous. Knowing what's doable and what's not? That's wise. Sharing the spoils fairly? That's humane. There has never been a great gangster in this world who lacked any of these 5 virtues." The Hong Kong edition of Martin Scorsese's mobster classic Goodfellas is shrewdly titled with a Chinese proverb directly taken from this story in the Zhuangji. Dao Yi Yu Dao. Gangsters have their Tao too. The notion of Tao, central not only to Taoism but to all traditional Chinese philosophies, literally means way and generally refers to the course of nature, the regular processes and patterns that shape everything. More specifically, Tao also means the right way, both in the pragmatic sense of an effective way of doing something, and in the ethical sense of doing something in a morally correct way. The saying, "gangsters have their Tao too," combines these pragmatic and ethical meanings. Criminals, too, must follow some right way to succeed, and moreover, they typically develop a strong sense of morality among themselves. Don't be a cowboy, don't go off the reservation, etc. The mobster term Goodfella is an example of the ethics of crime. In a criminal organization, morality is highly valued. Gangsters need to be good. They have to be loyal, brave, fair, and truthful with each other. They need to show generosity, even forgiveness wherever appropriate, but must also be capable of exercising stern justice in the interest of their community, whenever necessary. An Italian mafia member is respectfully called uomo di onore, a man of honor. As Bob Dylan says in one of his songs, to live outside the law, you must be honest. The same paradox is effectively stressed in the Chinese proverb, "Gangsters have their Tao too." The Chinese word for gangster is pronounced Dao, just like the way. It's a perfect pun. The moral qualities listed by Gangsta G are part of the mainstream Confucian ethical vocabulary. In early China, just as today, sagacity, courage, righteousness, wisdom, and humaneness. The chapter in the Zhuangji in which this short story occurs, in Brooke Zipperan's translation titled Breaking into Trunks, breaks metaphorically into the trunks of the moral language of its time to show how moral terminology has been misappropriated throughout society, and in particular by devious and violent rulers. The chapter chastises murderous feudal elites who adorn themselves with moral virtues, assign themselves honorable titles, and present their rule as benevolent. Those who steal belt buckles get executed, the chapter says, while those who steal kingdoms become lords. This too seems to be a timeless truth, since there is a verse in another Bob Dylan song saying the same. Steal a little and they throw you in jail. Steal a lot and they make you king. Ironically, Dylan stole this line from Eugene O'Neill's play, The Emperor Jones. Surely proving once again that good artists borrow, while great artists fucking steal. The high-minded self-description of the low-life gangsta G with its moral language is grotesquely incongruent, and therefore funny. More precisely, it is carnivalesque, because it satirically critiques the privileged social strata, like the medieval carnival, by revealing the less-than-holy characteristics of its members that normally remain hidden under graceful and dignified facades. The story not only expresses a social critique, however, it also conveys a philosophical critique of morality and specifically of moral language and moral exemplars. This becomes evident in the interpretation that immediately follows it in the Zhuangji. This story shows that just as good people cannot establish themselves in society without the Tao of moral exemplars, gangsters too cannot operate without the very same Tao. But there are just a few good people in this world, and a lot of bad ones. Therefore, while moral exemplars benefit the world a little, they harm it a lot more. After this pessimistic conclusion, that morality and moral role models have done much more damage than good, the chapter works itself up to an ever more radical rant against everything and everyone moral. Echoing some of the anti-moralist lines from the Tao Te Ching, but speaking more confrontationally and anarchistically, it says, "Crush and smash the moral exemplars. Set the gangsters and criminals free." Then it demands to slash the Confucian role models Zhengxian and Shiqiu, and to make the philosophers Yang Zhu and Mao Di shut up. Not stopping there, it wants to eliminate all elaborate craftwork, saying that the fingers of Master Carpenter Cui must be broken. All this needs to be done to restore an idyllic past when a simple, innocent, and peaceful lifestyle supposedly existed, and was subsequently destroyed by the cunning inventions of morality, artisanship, technology, and governance. Such a lifestyle is described almost literally with lines from the Tao Te Ching. Neighboring states are within sight of one another, and the sounds of chicken and dogs are mutually heard. People reach old age and die without traveling back and forth. In those times, perfect order prevailed. Interpreters tend to read this all literally. The British translator A.C. Graham ascribed the whole chapter, along with those that surround it, to an individual author who strayed from the core message of the Zhuangji and whom he identifies as the primitivist. According to Graham, the primitivist is an extremist who despises the whole of moral and aesthetic culture and wants to return to the simplest mode of life. For Graham, the texts written by the primitivist are political polemics, promoting a Daoist conception of society in competition with other ideologies of the time. Somewhat contradictorily, this extremist Daoist ideology, as Graham writes, is informed by un-Daoistic passions, scorn, and anger. In Graham's primitivist reading, Gangsta G's reflections are part of a political treaty written by a bad Daoist, a fanatic who cannot control his emotions and, as Graham says, only has vicious contempt. This vicious contempt makes the primitivist a mirror image of the villains he criticizes. He does not shy away from violence to realize his political vision of a perfect order and become something like a Daoist counterpart of the modern-day Cambodian dictator Pol Pot, who wanted to brutally force his whole country into a primitive form of communism. A problem with the primitivist interpretation, however, of the Breaking Into Trunks chapter is that it suggests extremist messages hard to reconcile with the rest of the Zhuangji. Moreover, as Graham admits, it reads quite un-Daoistic passions into the text. It does not register the satirical tone that comes to the fore in passages such as Gangsta G's dialogue. It sees only anger and no humor. Such a non-humorous reading may be likened to a literal understanding of contemporary stand-up comedians, or philosophers, if you will. If you do not recognize their irony and intentional exaggeration, you may well regard them, in Graham's words, as extremists who despise the whole of moral and aesthetic culture. Rather than as an intro to an extremist political manifesto, the Tao of Gangsters dialogue may be read as an intro to a satirical social critique. Its main point, then, is to subvert the moral exemplars mentioned by Gangsta Ji, the protagonists of the dominant ethical narratives in early China. In a satirical way, Gangsta Ji debunks not only the abundant moral hypocrisies in early Chinese society, but also the ethical myths on which these were founded. Just as the carnival in pre-modern Europe revealed the ambiguities of the Christian master narratives and their supposedly immaculate protagonists. The whole Breaking into Trunks chapter, not only the Gangsta Ji story, reveals the ambiguities and the impurity of the ethical legends of early China, and their supposedly spotless moral heroes. The end of the chapter summarizes this succinctly. Everyone knows how to point out what's wrong with those who are taken to be evil. But no one knows how to point out what's wrong with those who are taken to be good. This is why we are in such a mess. Like Nietzsche, who wrote in Twilight of the Idols, who revealed the dark side of moral exemplars of the Western tradition, the Zhuangzi satirically reveals how in social and historical reality, any moral story, any moral vocabulary, and any moral hero, without exception, can be put to both good and bad use. There is no moral narrative and no moral exemplar that is in and of itself pure. With ironic exaggeration and subtlety, the Tao of Gangsters story and the chapter Breaking into Trunks showed what Martin Scorsese showed much later in Goodfellas. Morality is a highly volatile social tool and up for anyone's grabs. It not only brings out and encourages the best in people, likewise, it brings out the worst. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it spoke to you. I hope you were able to be imparted with a bit of wisdom and knowledge from that. That is going to be it for today's show. I'm cutting this one a little bit short because of things going on at home right now. But I did want to get an episode out, and I just kind of had this sort of random mythological grab bag that I kind of wanted to play with. And I'm also very excited. I'm, oh man, like, okay, I don't want to give anything away too much up front, but I may have co-hosts again soon, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really jazzed about it. I'm fucking super psyched. These are two dudes that I fucking love dearly. I trust them implicitly, and they have been two of my biggest cheerleaders in my whole podcasting endeavor. So I appreciate the fuck out of these guys, and they're two of the, man, I don't know. Like I said, I don't want to blow it up too much, but if we can capture lightning in a bottle on audio as opposed to, it in line with how we converse and act and hang out, then I think, listeners, you're going to really enjoy the fuck out of what may be around the corner here. So it's still in the works. I don't want to, say anything's a certainty. We're trying to, hammer out the details and figure out all the ins and outs and what have yous. So, but hopefully, by the next episode, I will have co-hosts. And, so fingers crossed. Like I said, we're working it out. But I'm super psyched. Oh, man. Because, I like doing this show. I love doing this show. But, I don't know. I just feel that, like, it's weird and kind of, I have weird ego issues, and, like, I don't want people to just have to listen to me. Like, it's good to have other opinions and whatnot. And I think that banter is one of the reasons that people love podcasting as well. Especially when you get the right mix of people together, and man, this is going to be a good mix. So yeah, anyways, okay. That's enough of me rambling on. This has been Kook Sprinks and Iconoclasts. I'm Mike No Haikeboshi. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week. Peace.